Okay, good morning everyone. Let's make a start. This week we're looking at Emile Durkheim, okay, and these are the aims of today's lecture. So we're looking at the development of sociological positivism. We're going to go on to look at anarchy and suicide, and we're going to be looking at crime as a social fact. Now, I know at the moment these terms don't mean a great deal to you, but hopefully we'll do by the end of today's session. Okay, so that's what we're doing, and we're looking at firstly the development of sociological positivism. Okay, now, as we do each week, I'm going to give you a quick recap of some of the things that we've looked at, because it's really particularly important, because today marks a turning point in terms of how we address criminological theory. It represents a turning point in terms of how we address this subject matter. So far then, we've looked at two broad theories then, or one theory, one method. We've looked at classicism and we've looked at positivism. And we noted that positivism is split into two strands. Okay, so we have individual positivism and we have sociological positivism. You're all familiar with this. And we all noted then that positivism itself is split into two. Okay, so it's, wrong way around. Individual positivism is split into two. You've got biological and psychological positivism. Okay? Now, so far, we've looked at this. Okay? Now, what we're looking at today represents a marked departure, because we're going to be looking at sociological forms of positivism. Okay? Now, as you know, positivism isn't a theory. Classicism is a theory. Positivism is not a theory, it is a method. Brilliant. Okay, it's a method. It's a mode of inquiry, isn't it? Okay. So, why is today so special then? Well, today is particularly special because we're going to be looking at this subject matter in a fundamentally, radically new way. Okay. So, what is that way then that is? In what way is it radical? Well, so far, when we've looked at individual positivism and we've looked at classicism, we've noted that both of these approaches then seek to do one thing, or seek to show one thing. Okay, they are both correctionist in nature. Okay, that's the one thing. They have many things in common, and one of the things they do have in common is that they are both correctionist. Now, what we mean by that is that crime is something that can and ought to be controlled. Okay. Now, each of these different approaches, then, classicism and positivism, they argue that we can control crime, but they do so in very different ways. So their policy, the policy that comes, the policy that flows from these approaches then, is radically different. Okay, so a quick recap then. What's the policy that flows from classicism? How do they say we can control crime? Anyone? What's the policy? What is it they were concerned about? Remember, they were part of the Enlightenment project. It was about progress, wasn't it? It was about reform, reform, reform. So what specifically did they want to reform? What is it that they wanted to change? How did they believe we could control crime?
Punishment. The form of punishment.
The form of punishment, yes, exactly. Explain what you mean. You're absolutely right.
They wanted to make it less barbaric and
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so their concerns then was that the old system, the old frameworks of punishment was barbaric, it was disproportionate, it was arbitrary. You were going to say?
I was going to say they wanted to move away from inflicting punishment on the body to the mind.
Right, so there was a significant shift, wasn't there? There was a shift from punishing the body to punishing the soul, or to punish the mind. Now, what they tried to do then, they tried to set up a reasoned, rational, clear system of punishment that would seek to deter. Okay? Do you remember we looked at our action? We said that actions were guided by either pleasure or they were guided by pain. Okay, so we are hedonistic. So if you set up a criminal justice system that increases the pain for crime, then people will rationally choose to make a free will decision not to commit criminal acts. Okay? You're all familiar with this, we've covered this. Okay, so that's the policy that flows from this. What's the policy that flows from positivism? How do they say we can control crime? What's the policy? How do they say that we can control crime? What do they say the causes of crime are then? What are the causes of crime under positivism?
Either like genetics or
pathology, sickness and illness, isn't it? It's a pathology. So that pathology is either biologically or psychologically rooted, isn't it? So you've got the two forms, biological positivism and psychological positivism. Biological positivism says then that individuals are pathologically or biologically there's something wrong with them. The psychological positivists believe then that there's something wrong, pathological, with the experiences of the individual. Okay, so they basically argue then that the policy that flows from their position is one of treatment. Okay? Right, now this should all make sense to you because we've covered this ground already. But the point that I'm making here is that all of the approaches both the approaches that we've looked at so far have one main thing in common. Okay? They argue that crime is something that can and ought to be controlled. Now, the reason I'm emphasising this is because what we're going to look at today challenges this very notion. It challenges, in many ways, the preconceived ideas that we have about crime. Do you remember we said in the very first week that one of the reasons why most of you are studying criminal justice or criminology is because you want to engage in two things. You want to understand the causes of crime, and you want to understand how crime can be controlled. That's pretty much why a lot of people study criminology. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to challenge that framework of thinking. Okay, we're going to look at this subject matter in a radically new way. And that radically new way is grounded in sociological positivism. Okay, it's sociological positivism. So this is the first time we've looked at sociological positivism. Right, positivism, okay, is a mode of inquiry. Okay, it's a mode of inquiry. It's a way of seeing, it's a way of looking that's grounded in the natural sciences. Okay. Right, now, I used this example a few weeks ago. The alien spacecrafts. Right, and the car. There's that car. Right, what was I trying to illustrate with this example? The example I said to you that none of you will ever forget. You're looking at the board thinking, what was that all about? What was the point I was trying to illustrate here? Anyone remember? Yes. I'll go for it. Another guess.
Is it you was trying to show us the difference between objective and subjective?
Brilliant. Okay. What I'm saying to you is that there are two forms of knowledge. Okay. There's objective and there's subjective forms of knowledge. Okay. Now, what I was trying to illustrate with the example is that we can reveal two forms of knowledge simply by using this example. So, what's the objective knowledge then? Well, the objective knowledge is this. It's that the alien spacecraft hovering above this scenario, okay, can deduce some objective knowledge simply by observing. Okay, so the knowledge that they can deduce from this then is that every time this light goes red, this car will stop. Okay? Every time this light goes green, the car will go. Now that's a piece of knowledge that they can attain simply by observing the pattern and recurrent nature of social phenomena. Okay, so pattern and recurrent nature. So from that then, we can develop laws, universal laws. So we can say then that generally speaking, when this light goes red, this car will stop. When it goes red, when it goes green, it will start again. So we can deduce this in a form of knowledge, objective knowledge. What can't the alien tell us simply by observing these patterns and recurrent phenomena?
Why they're stopping.
Why? Okay, in order to understand why this driver is stopping, you'd need to speak to the driver, wouldn't you? Okay, so the driver would say, the reason I'm stopping is simply because if I don't stop, there will be an accident, or if I don't stop, I will be given some kind of driving violation ticket from the police. Okay, so the why, that's the subjective then. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, sociological positivism is all about revealing objective forms of knowledge. Knowledge that is rooted in the pattern and recurrent nature of social relations, in the pattern and current nature of society itself. Okay? So they use the scientific method in order to tap to reveal these universal laws. Okay? So it seeks to be objective. Remember, that's what scientific approach is all about, isn't it? It's about revealing objective forms of knowledge. Okay? Now, And it's really important that we grasp this. So I'm going to give you another example of what it is they're trying to do. So this is about the development of sociological positivism. Here's another scenario. Have I given you the bumblebee scenario yet?
Yeah.
Yes? Good, okay, right, let's... Right, there's that bumblebee. It's not a very good bumblebee. It's a bumblebee we're saying. Right. Bumblebee, 3 people, poet, gardener and a child. Okay? The poet says that the purpose of the bumblebee is to look beautiful. Because that's the sort of thing the poets say, isn't it? They see beauty in everything. So the purpose of the bumblebee is to look beautiful. The gardener says that the purpose of the bumblebee is to pollinate flowers. The child says that the purpose of the bumblebee is to sting people. There are 2 forms of knowledge here, objective and subjective. What's the objective knowledge? What do they all agree on?
It's a bumblebee.
That it's a bumblebee, it's a bumblebee. There you go, bumblebee. What's the subjective form of knowledge? The why. Brilliant. Okay, the purpose there. Right, the opinion really then, isn't it? Okay, so sociological positivism then is all about revealing objective forms of knowledge. Knowledge that is simply there, it's out there, and all we need to do is develop scientific or apply the scientific method in order to tap in to find these laws, this knowledge that's there, that's simply there. Okay, so what we're doing today then that's so fundamentally different is that we're providing a sociological analysis to crime. Previously, classicism, positivism, or individual positivism in particular, so individual. So classicism. Classicism focused on the offence or the offender? On the offence. Okay, so what crime has been committed, what can we do to deter people from committing that crime? What's individual positivism focusing on? The offence or the offender? Brilliant. Right, now what we're doing today, again what is radically different, is that we're looking at crime as a social phenomenon. Okay, so what we're doing then, we're looking at crime as a social fact. Crime is a social fact. So this marks then a radical departure in 2 respects there. Okay, so we're looking at a sociological explanation for crime, and we're moving away from those frameworks of seeking to understand why people or how we can control crime. Because there's a preoccupation with that, isn't there? We need to control crime. Well, this is going to shift the way we look at this phenomenon for the first time. Okay, so in order to do this then, we're going to be looking at Emile Durkheim. Could I emphasise that it's Emile Durkheim, not Emily Durkheim. Emily Durkheim often pops up in an exam paper. So it's Emile Durkheim, not Emily Durkheim. Right, now, what is it we must do before we go on to look at any theory? Context, brilliant. Right, we need to situate it, don't we? Why do we need to situate the theory? Why is that important?
So it's developed.
Because
So we know how it's developed.
we know how it's developed. Right, so if we look at the context will often inform the theory. No theory develops in a vacuum, does it? We understand the context reveals more about why the theory is developed. Okay, so understand the context, understand the theory. Right, now, does anybody know the context in which Emile Durkheim was writing? Any ideas? Anyone heard of Emile Durkheim? Most of you should have heard of Durkheim before. Right, so tell me, what nationality was he to start with?
French.
He was French, wasn't he? Right, okay. When was he writing?
French Revolution.
Right, the French Revolution, right. He was writing during a tumultuous period in French history, okay? We had the Dreyfus affair, which for those of you that don't know, was a political scandal. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Dreyfus affair, but there was also the setting up of the Third Republic in France. Now, what do these things imply then? What do these things tell us? What's important about the context? Well, the context is important here because during the period in which Durkheim was writing, there was radical change in France. Okay? It was a tumultuous period in French history. Okay, so radical change. It seemed as though everything around Emile Durkheim was breaking up. Okay, so the establishment of the Third Republic, the Dreyfus Affair. So this was a pretty radical revolutionary period. So what does this mean then? What's important about this context? Well, this was a period of change. This drives one question. Okay, this is the question that preoccupied the vast majority of Durkheim's writing. He wanted to understand this. What is it that makes societies cohere? What is it that makes societies bond together? What is it that makes societies stick and cohere? What makes a stable society, in other words? Okay, there's all this change going around here. We want to understand what makes a stable society. Now, we're going to come back to that. Just put that as a footnote for a moment, because we're going to come back to that. But that really drives Emile Durkheim's work. What is it that makes societies cohere? Okay? Right now, before we go on to look at this any further, there's a few other things that we need to do to set the scene. Durkheim is a sociological positivist. Okay? He believes that society is both structured and interdependent. Okay, structured and independent. What he's basically saying is this, is that society is a system. It's a system made up of interconnected, interrelated, interdependent parts. Okay? Society is a system. So, if society is a system, then we should look at it as a whole. And this is what he does. He draws a biological analogy. He said that in many ways, society, just excuse me to draw another really bad picture, is like a plant. Okay, there's that plant. All parts of this plant then are interdependent, they're structured, interdependent and interrelated then. Okay? So this is a system, this plant is a system. All parts of this plant are interdependent. But perhaps most importantly, in addition to being interrelated and independent, and this is a really important word here, all parts of this plant, according to Emile Durkheim, serve a function. Okay? Now, those of you that have looked at Durkheim before, you'll be familiar with the next term that I'm about to give you. Emile Durkheim is what we call a structural functionalist. Structural functionalist. And this is what we mean by that. So he provides us with this biological analogy. Okay? He said that society is like a system. It's made of interrelated, interdependent parts. So not only is it made up of interrelated, interdependent parts, but each part of this plant, each part of this system serves a function. Now, I'm no biologist, but plants have roots, don't they? What's the function of the roots? What's the function of a plant's roots? Very basically.
Hold it down.
Well, it grounds it, doesn't it? Yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It roots ground it. But I was thinking more it sucks up water. The roots are there to suck up, but that's obviously not the technical term. I'm not a biologist, but that's so they serve a function, don't they? And they ground the plant, don't they? Hold it down without it kind of floats around. Okay, right. This. What's the function of the stem? What function does that serve? So you see.
Where the water and nutrients can get to the plant.
It's kind of like the backbone, isn't it? It's like the skeleton, everything, the sort of leaves and the flower. Right, so we've got the leaves. Right, what's the function of the leaves?
To gather sunlight.
Photosynthesis. Yeah. What's the function of the flower?
To attract pollen.
To look pretty. That's the reproductive part of the plant, isn't it? Okay. So each part of this plant then serves a function. Now, it's possible. It's entirely possible for this plant to become dysfunctional. How does this plant become dysfunctional? Well, if I was to lop off these, if I was to take off the leaves, the plant then becomes dysfunctional, becomes sick, doesn't it? So this starts to wilt. Okay, this kind of You get this sort of stuff going on. Yeah. Right, so each part of this plant then is interrelated, interconnected, interdependent. Okay? So for this to be a healthy plant, a functioning plant, it needs to be, each part of this plant needs to be working well. It needs to be a healthy plant. Durkheim says that society is like this. Society doesn't have leaves, like a reproductive organ and roots. Society, according to Durkheim, is made up of institutions. Okay? So kinship, family, is an institution that's at the heart of society. There's a range of other things that exist that we don't want to look at. Right, so we're still setting the scene then. We're looking at the development of sociological positivism. Now, we've seen from the video that I uploaded a few weeks ago that during this period then, people were looking for new frameworks of understanding. So we have the Enlightenment thinkers, people like Beccaria and Bentham. We also have the functionists, people like Lombroso, for example, who were trying to explain social phenomena by applying this new mode of inquiry, this new scientific method. Okay? What is it that drives, what is it that grounds this scientific method? When we talk about scientific method, what does it seek to do? What is it that sets it apart from other methods? Well, firstly, it seeks to reveal objective forms of knowledge. It seeks to be objective, doesn't it? Okay, so if it's objective, it means then that it's something that can be what? It can be, or falsifiable, to use Popper's term. Okay? Right, so it's a scientific method. So this is a new way of seeing them. Now, Emile Durkheim, he wanted to apply this new way of seeing, this new scientific method to understanding social phenomena. Okay? And he did this in a radically revolutionary way. Does anybody know what he did in order to try to prove his method, to try to prove his sociology? He conducted a big study. Does anybody know what it is? Suicide. Excellent. He conducted a huge study on suicide. Right, now does anybody know why he chose suicide as a topic? Because he was a manic depressive or anything like this. But he chose suicide for a particular reason. If you wanted to understand...
Was it because there was high rates of suicide at the time?
He noted that there were fluctuations. So in certain parts of Europe there were higher rates of suicide than lower. Yes, that was one. So he noted that as a phenomenon and he wanted to understand why that could be. Absolutely right. But why suicide though? So there were changing patterns.
Is it because it was thought that it was a purely psychological, like inward matter, not to do with society?
You're a genius. This is precisely the reason. If we want to understand suicide, usually if somebody kills themselves, we tend to provide kind of sociological answers, psychological answers, that there's something inward. So we need to understand something about that individual narrative, something about their biography. What was going on individually. Okay, so suicide is usually something that's understood at an individual level. Durkheim revolutionarily said that we could understand suicide as a social problem, not as an individual problem, but as a social problem. So, he's saying then that we can apply the method of the natural sciences to understanding the phenomena of suicide. So we can look at social forces, social factors outside of the individual to understand this phenomena. Okay? So, he uses suicide then as a mechanism with which to prove his general sociology that there are social forces, social factors external to us that drive our behaviour. Okay? So what did he do then? Well, this is a really bad map of Europe. Something like this. We'll go down a bit. Right, bad map of Europe. Well, now what he noted was that that's a really bad map of Europe. What he noted was that in different parts of Europe there were higher or lower suicide rates. Okay, so for example, in the UK, he noted that, so UK suicide. Okay, so in the UK, he noted then that suicide rates were relatively high compared to, let's say, Spain, where suicide rates were relatively low compared to the UK. Okay, and he begins to, by using statistics, he said that statistics are useful things that we can use, but by using these statistics in an objective, value-free way, we can make conclusions. So he said that there was something going on here. If we could identify that there were some countries that had consistently higher suicide rates than other societies, why? What was the reason for that? What was the explanation that he found? Does anybody know? It wasn't that people in the UK had more kind of psychological problems. No, he's saying that these explanations could be grounded in broader external social forces or social factors. Why do you think he believed that suicide rates were different in different countries? What was the explanation? What was the driving force? We'll think about this. What was his main concern? Let's work backwards. Let's try to put ourselves in Durkheim's position. What was Durkheim's main concern? What was going on around him? Chaos. Okay, the French society break up, having a third republic being established. Okay, so there's chaos, right? So what does this lead him to want to question? What makes societies bond and stick together? Okay. Well, maybe the answer to that can be found here. Think about this then. During this period, so the 19th century then, there were certain things that were happening in terms of cultural things were developing during this period as well, or cultural developments. When we looked at, remember our timeline, let's do it this way. So there's the Industrial Revolution, here's our timeline. Pre-modernity, modernity. Okay, volcano erupts here. Okay, volcano erupts here. Volcano erupts in pre-modernity, what's the explanation?
Religion.
God's pissed off. Okay, so religion. You tend to situate your explanations within religious frameworks. Here, in modernity, we understand volcanoes erupting, tectonic plates shifting to science. Okay, right. So here, then, we note that religion has a much more central role to play in society. Okay, so there's a hint. What do you think the reason could be why these suicide rates were different?
Was it because it was obviously to do with religion, it was between Catholics and Protestants?
Right. He said that maybe the social institution of religion has an important role to play here. He noted that Catholic countries tended to have lower suicide rates generally across Europe, and generally countries who had Protestant forms of religion tended to have higher rates of suicide. Right, why is this important then? Why is religion important? What's the difference between these two religions? Well, there's a whole range of different differences between them. But one of the differences is that Catholic communities tend to have more extended kinship networks. Okay, so they tend to have lots of family, or historically they tended to have extended families, so lots of members of the family living in the same productive unit, in the same household. Whereas Protestant communities tend to be more self-sufficient, self-reliant. So basically here, in Catholic communities, there was greater support. In other words, and here's that word again, Catholic countries, or Catholic communities, tended to have a greater sense of coherence. They seemed more stable, they had more support. So, this was revolutionary then. This finding was revolutionary because for the first time then we begin to find forces outside of the individual, these social factors that seek to explain what is ostensibly what we might think is a kind of psychological problem. So here then we begin to see social facts at play. So we're beginning to see how external forces can impact upon our behaviour. Is this making sense? Yeah? So just to give you, so that was Durkheim's huge study. Another way that I always find this useful to understand, because it's kind of, you know, we're asking you to do a lot here. We're asking you to consider that there are forces outside of the individual that impact upon our behaviour. Well, you know, if I was to say to you that at 5:30, so here's a road, at 5:30 pretty much every single night of the week, Monday to Friday, these cars, okay, are going to be in a traffic jam. Okay? Now that fact exists independently of the individual, doesn't it? Okay? That fact exists outside of these individual drivers. So it's something, it's a social force. So these social forces then exist outside of the individual. If we reveal these forces, then we can develop these universal laws. Okay, is this making some sense? Right, okay, so that then is basically the development of sociological positivism. Okay, that's essentially what it seeks to say. Now, later on in the module, we're going to go on to look at other forms of sociological positivism. We're going to look at next week somebody called R.K. Merton, who develops this even further. Okay, so this really lays then the ground, the foundations for a radically new way of observing society, of looking at social relations. So you're probably sitting there thinking, yeah, this is all well and good, but what on earth has this got to do with crime? What on earth has this got to do with deviancy? Okay, well, I'm about to tell you. Right, now, everything that Durkheim says comes back to his general sociology. Everything is grounded in what I said to you earlier on, okay? That everything is interdependent, interrelated, interconnected. So society is like a plant, okay? Let's guess. What do you think he might then say about the phenomena of crime? Do you think he says that we need to look at individual explanations, or do you think we need to look at social explanations? What do you think he says? Have a guess. Right, so we need to look at social factors then, okay, that exist outside of the individual. That's exactly what he says. What else do you think he might say, given what I've said to you about his general sociology? Because everything comes from that. It's a logical development from what I've just told you. Crime is important and needed. He sort of says that. He doesn't use those words. Is functional. Brilliant. Right. He says that crime serves a function. Good. Right. So everything that he says then flows from, is a development from what I told you earlier on about his general sociology. So then, it's not surprising then that he says that crime serves a function. Okay? That begs the question, what functions do you think crime could serve? Because this is a strange position to take, isn't it?
Like when crime's committed, laws can be made from it, and when like crimes committed, things can be.
Speak up, say it again, sorry.
I can't explain it.
Go on, have a go, you can.
As in, obviously, if there was no crime, then no laws would be made, no changes would happen, no, like society wouldn't really move forward if nothing was ever wrong.
So you could explain it. You're a genius, right? Change. Crime is a force for change. Crime is a source for social change. He says that crime has an adaptive function. Crime has an adaptive function. What do you think that means? So this is, I mean, we're beginning to see this subject in a radically different way now, aren't we? Because, you know, so far your mindset is crime is something that can and ought to be controlled. What Durkheim is basically saying is, hold on a minute, Durkheim actually, crime actually serves a function. It can actually lead to social change, so it has an adaptive function. So how might crime lead to social change then? What social change can crime bring about? Any thoughts? Can anyone think of any examples? Because this is a radical position to take, isn't it? Well, Durkheim uses this example. He uses the example of Socrates. Okay, but we're not going to use the example of Socrates. We're going to use this person, Nelson Mandela. Right, Nelson Mandela. He was incarcerated for over 20 years for, at the time, being a terrorist. Okay, because he was a member of the ANC who were fighting against the racist regime of apartheid in South Africa. Now, he was incarcerated as a terrorist. Okay? Subsequently, 20-odd years later, he was released from prison. Okay? Now, this is a good example of how a criminal act can lead to social change. Because what Mandela was doing was actually, by engaging in criminal act, he was actually trying to test the boundaries. He was actually trying to change South African society. The vehicle that he used to bring about social change was criminality. Okay? Now, the example that Durkheim uses is one of Socrates, but the same principle applies to Nelson Mandela then. Okay? So criminals, in committing crime, they're actually testing the boundaries. They're testing boundaries, the moral boundaries of what's right and wrong. So let's look at a contemporary example, one that perhaps you might relate to a bit better. You all drive, don't you? Most of you drive, and most of you drive on the motorways. What speed do you drive at on the motorway?
70.
Be honest. Well, I don't drive. What's the speed limit at the moment? It's 70. Right, put your hands up if you drive over 70 miles an hour on the motorway. More of you put your hands up. Come on, be honest. Okay, I think generally speaking, the general consensus is, from people that I've asked, that the speed limit isn't actually 70, it's
65.
No, it's not 65. It's more likely to be around about 80. I think most people drive on the motorway at a speed of around about 80 miles an hour. Okay, now the reason some of you are smiling, because you know you do that. Now, this could be an example of precisely what Emile Durkheim is talking about here, is that although we know that the speed limit is 70, most of us drive higher than that. Now that could actually serve, so by doing that, that is a crime, isn't it? Okay? But by doing that, you could actually be, by committing this crime, you could also be providing this adaptive function of criminality by testing the boundaries, by moving the boundaries, by saying, well, this law is no longer appropriate, we need to move the boundaries, we need to shift the law. Okay? So then, crime serves a function, or can serve the function of social change. Okay? Now, there are some problems with this, and we'll look at these in the seminar. One of the problems with this is it the criminal act that brings about social change, or is it the idea that brings about social change? Okay, we'll talk about this in the seminar, but I'll just plant that seed there for a moment for you to think about. Is it the idea that brings about social change, or is it the criminal act? He says it's the criminal act. Right, so, crime then serves this adaptive function. He goes on to say a few other pretty radical things as well. He says that not only does crime serve a function, but he says that crime is actually normal. There you go, crime is normal. He says that crime is normal in two respects. One, because it's inevitable, and secondly, because it's universal. So it's inevitable and universal. So crime is everywhere, it's ubiquitous, it's universal, it's in every society. He says, famously, that even in a society of saints, there will be criminality. Because there will always be one or two people who will be tempted to violate the law. Okay, so even in a society of saints, the minus infraction would be a crime. So picking your nose would be like the equivalent of kind of murdering someone. Okay, so there will always be infringements, there will always be violations. So even in a society of saints, there will be criminality. Crime is normal, it's inevitable and universal. There is you can't conceive of a society where there will be no criminality. So in many ways then, he's saying this. He's saying that crime is inevitable, it's universal, crime is a social fact. crime exists in all societies. It's normal, inevitable, and universal. So, it's normal, functional. He goes on to say some other things about crime. He says that crime, in addition to being normal, in addition to serving its function of bringing about social change, can also help highlight what he calls the moral boundaries. Highlight the moral boundaries. What does he mean by this? What was his... What? There wasn't a question, but carry on. Say that again. Go on. Can you say that?
I thought you knew right or wrong, I was talking like that.
What was right and wrong? Yeah. You're absolutely right. Exactly what he was saying. He was saying then that crime is a way of identifying what is right and what is wrong. It's a mechanism for highlighting the moral boundaries. What was his main concern? Right at the very beginning we said, what was his main concern? What informed his general sociology? What was going on around him? What was his preoccupation with what made societies cohere? Right, and he says that crime can actually serve the function of highlighting the moral boundaries which helps society to cohere, to stick together. This is an odd thing to say, isn't it? Crime serves a function, a social function of helping societies to cohere. So how does it do this then? Well, he says that when somebody commits a crime, they offend what he calls the moral sentiments. Okay? And then by punishing somebody who's committed a crime, we, to quote Durkheim again, we heal the wounds done to the collective sentiments, to these moral sentiments. So the example that we can use then is that from time to time there are really big criminal acts that kind of offend the public conscience, that offend the kind of, you know, people, it creates this kind of moral panic. It doesn't use these terms, but, you know, so people kind of are together in their outrage. So one of the things that I'm thinking of is the Jamie Boulder affair, for example, the Sower murders, for example. These really bind communities together in their collective outrage. So, you know, this is where you've got mums dropping off their kids at the school gates, talking to other mums. Isn't it terrible that this has happened, blah, blah, blah. But what that does is it serves the function of highlighting the moral boundaries. It serves the function of highlighting what is right and what is wrong. We are collective in our condemnation of that criminal act. So by punishing individuals, we are re-establishing, reaffirming the moral boundaries. We are highlighting the moral boundaries, what it is that helps us stick together, that we have more things in common than not. Okay? So society, crime rather, serves the function of highlighting these moral boundaries then. Okay, is this making sense? Yeah? Right now, Durkheim says that at the heart of all societies is what he calls the conscience collective, or the collective conscience. The collective conscience, the conscience collective. Now, the collective conscience, or the conscience collective, is a set of shared values, morals and beliefs. Shared values, morals and beliefs. Okay?
Can you just repeat that again, please?
Yeah, at the heart of all societies is the collective conscience, which is a set of shared values, morals and beliefs. Okay? So all societies then have at their core a collective conscience, which is a set of values, morals and beliefs that we all share in common. Okay? Now he says that the nature of this collective conscience changes. Okay? He says that there is what he calls mechanic solidarity and organic solidarity. Okay, now these are different forms of the collective conscience. Now, he doesn't use this particular analogy, but I'm going to use it to help you understand this. So the mechanism that we've been using throughout this module is our timeline. So here's the Industrial Revolution, which marks this fundamental transformation in the nature of social relations. Pre-modernity, modernity. Okay, now he says that mechanical solidarity, the nature of collective conscience, is different in pre-modernity to what it's like in modernity. Okay? He says that the nature of the collective conscience in pre-modernity is what he calls mechanic solidarity. He says that these are heterogeneous communities. These are tight-knit communities. Remember I used the example of, you're all familiar with, these tight-knit small communities that are they're pretty self-sufficient. Okay? And then we move towards, in modernity, the metropolis, the big city. Here then, rather than having these small heterogeneous communities, sorry, I've got this wrong way around, sorry. These are homogeneous, sorry. Homogeneous. And these are heterogeneous. Okay? Basically these communities in modernity are diverse. Sorry. So homogeneous to heterogeneous. Now, really what he's saying here, okay, in a nutshell, is that these communities here have a highly established sense of collective conscience. So the shared values, morals and beliefs are very well identified. Okay, so here then, the collective conscience is highly defined. So people know what is right and what is wrong. There's a high degree of resemblance between individuals. So here then, what is criminal is pretty well established. There are very few shades of grey here. Okay? So these are tight-knit communities then that have a very high, highly established, highly defined collective conscience. Now he says that in organic societies in modernity, these are characterised by heterogeneous values, morals and beliefs. So these are much more diverse communities then. So in these more diverse communities, the collective conscience is weaker. Here it's strong, here it's weak. Here it's weak because it's more diverse. There's more values, more beliefs. Okay? Or there's a plurality of values and beliefs. It's not as well established, not as well identified. So why am I mentioning this then? Well, the reason I'm mentioning this is because he says that crime is something that is very much associated with modernity. He says that advanced